welcoming Dr. Norman Finkelstein. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Norman Finkelstein.
Well, thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here. It's a really beautiful city. I teach in Chicago, not by choice, but by lack of alternate options. And I always complain about the weather in Chicago, and they always say, well, you wouldn't want to live in Minnesota. And now I know what a lie that is. I go back and tell them, on the basis of empirical evidence, I can tell you the weather in Minnesota is just beautiful. I was here all of today. I think that's sufficient evidence for a social scientist, at least. Okay, I'm going to slightly modify the topic of this evening's remarks, but I will certainly get to the issue that was raised in the proposed topic for the evening, namely the relationship between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism. The topic I want to address this evening more broadly is one that's been more and more uppermost in my own mind as I study the topic. Namely, if you look at the record, the documentary record on the Israel-Palestine conflict, the past, the historical record, the present, which mostly means the human rights record, and the future, which mostly means the legal diplomatic record for resolving the conflict. If you look at the record on the Israel-Palestine conflict, the past, the present, and the future, it's remarkably uncomplicated. It's as straightforward as any conflict gets. And yet, when you enter the public arena, the arena of the media, of political life, we're often told, we're always told, that the Israel-Palestine conflict is remarkably complicated and controversial. That unlike most other conflicts, this one is very complicated and controversial. And the topic I want to look at this evening, or the theme of this evening's remarks, is how do you account for the fact that when you look at the actual documentary record, the conflict is remarkably uncontroversial, remarkably uncomplicated, but yet when you enter the public arena, the arena of politics and media, it suddenly seems very complicated and very controversial. And the thesis, to use that expression, my thesis or argument this evening is going to be that the preponderance of what passes for controversy and complicatedness, complexity on the Israel-Palestine conflict, the preponderance of the controversy is fabricated, it's concocted, it's contrived, the purpose being to sow confusion about what the actual record shows and to deflect attention from that actual record. Let me begin by illustrating the point in a fairly vivid way, I think. As some of you may know, in July 2004, the International Court of Justice, the World Court, rendered a landmark advisory opinion on the wall that Israel is building in the occupied territories. And for those of you who are familiar with that fact, you'll know that the International Court of Justice decided in its advisory opinion that the wall Israel was building and still continues to build is illegal under international law, that Israel is legally bound to dismantle the wall and to pay compensation for the damages wrought in the construction. In fact, in my opinion at any rate, that's the least interesting part of the decision. What's the most interesting, I think, is the following. In order for the World Court to render a decision on the legality of the wall, it had to investigate a large number of other questions. For those of you who are familiar with the lingo of the Israel-Palestine conflict, the so-called peace process, there's this expression, the final status issues. And the final status issues refers to those issues which we're told are so complicated, so controversial, that we can't deal with them at the beginning of negotiations. We have to put them off, defer them to the very end of negotiations. As it happened, the World Court, in order to reach its decision on the legality of the wall, had to address preliminarily all of those, or nearly all of those, final status questions. So, for example, the first of those questions was the borders. What are the proper borders for the state of Israel? What are the proper borders for the future Palestinian state? The World Court said, this is not a controversial question. Under international law, it's inadmissible to conquer territory by war. It's a fundamental principle anchored in Article 2 of the United Nations Charter. So says the World Court, all the territory which Israel conquered in June 1967, which for our purposes means the whole of the West Bank, the whole of Gaza, the World Court keeps saying in its decision, these are occupied Palestinian territories, uppercase O, uppercase P, uppercase T. Israel has no title to a single atom of the territory in the West Bank or Gaza. Number two, the question of the settlements, those 400,000 settlers and vast settlements that Israel has built in the West Bank. What's their status under international law? World Court says not complicated. Under Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, settlements are illegal. It's illegal for an occupying power to transfer its population to occupied territory. All the settlers, all the settlements, says the World Court, illegal under international law. Not complicated. Now, most of you are familiar with that third complicated question, the question of the status of Jerusalem. And Israel claims Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, is part of its eternal and undivided capital. But not so, says the World Court. Jerusalem was conquered, East Jerusalem was conquered during the June 1967 war. That is to say, it's occupied Palestinian territory. It is occupied Palestinian territory to which Israel has no legal claim whatsoever. So on those issues, I'll get to the fourth one presently, the other complicated, we're told, complicated issue is the question of the Palestinian refugees. I'll get to that in a moment. But on three of the crucial final status issues, the World Court says not complicated at all. That's only half the story. The other half of the story is, what was the vote? World Court decisions are often quite close. One of those which may be familiar to people, they're sort of like, incidentally, our Supreme Court votes, because once you get to that level, it must have been quite controversial in order to get that high in the first place, which is why our own Supreme Court decisions are often quite close. And in the case of the World Court, I've been reading many of their decisions, and they're quite lengthy usually, and they're often, not always, but often quite close. What's interesting about this decision for our purposes is, bear in mind, we're talking about the controversial, or purportedly controversial questions. The vote wasn't close at all. The vote was 14-1. This was not a close vote. And in fact, the one negative vote came unsurprisingly from the judge who was an American national, Judge Bergenthal. And even Judge Bergenthal's vote was a very, or I should say his negative vote, was a very cautious one. Usually when they're deciding against the majority opinion, usually they call their statement a dissent. But Judge Bergenthal did not call his statement a dissent. He called his separate opinion, he called it a declaration. And in the declaration, he began by saying, in fact, I agree with much of what the majority had to say in this opinion. And he went on to say that on the crucial question, namely the status of those settlements, those 400,000 settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, he said, in fact, I agree with the court. Those settlements, those settlers are illegal under international law. And if the wall that Israel is building is designed to incorporate those settlements, which in fact it is, he says, I agree. The wall is illegal under international law, which in effect means that all 15 judges on the World Court, all of whom incidentally are very feisty, I shouldn't say all, a large number, are very feisty, very independent, and I have to acknowledge, very clever. As I said, in reading the decisions, they show nimble, acute minds at work. But nonetheless, these are not, in the real world, these are not controversial issues. The claim that the settlements, the borders, the status of Jerusalem are complicated is simply false. There is no complicatedness, which is very striking. I'm right now reading, for those of you who are veterans of the Central American Wars, you'll know that in 1984, the World Court rendered a decision on the U.S. mining of the Nicaragua harbors. Now that decision is quite substantial. If you include the dissents, it comes to a hefty 1,000 pages, which I've been plowing through. There was some elements of controversy there. When you come to the decision on the wall that Israel is building, everything, it all comes to like 150 pages. The opinion, there were no dissents. Judge Bergenthal's declaration, it barely comes to anything. And that's the topic I want to look at this evening. How do you account for that fact? That in the real world, the documentary record among experts and authorities, there's simply no real controversy regarding the Israel-Palestine conflict. I want to illustrate that point. I'll give you a couple of examples. Let me begin with the historic record. There are enough people in this room who are of my age cohort or beyond, so they'll know the Israel-Palestine conflict as it used to be discussed in American life. And one of the questions that always came up, in fact, it was the main question that always came up when you discussed the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict is, how did those Palestinians become refugees in 1948? For those of you who are new to the topic, and those of you who aren't, just bear with me because I want everyone to be able to follow. In 1948, after the declaration of the State of Israel, a war broke out between Israel and its Arab neighbors. And in the course of the war, roughly 80% of the population of the area that became Israel, roughly 80% of the Palestinian population, ended up outside the borders of the newly formed Israeli state. And they settled in places like what we now call the West Bank, Gaza, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, and elsewhere, and they came to be called the Palestinian refugees. And there's always been, or there was, this huge debate. How did those Palestinians become refugees in 1948? And up until, you could say, up until the late 1980s, the standard claim, one which you found in textbooks and of course in the media as well, was that what happened in 1948 is that the Arab armies were poised to attack the newly born state of Israel, and they transmitted through radio broadcasts the message to the Palestinians who lived in the area that became Israel. They told them to flee, to clear the field for the invading Arab armies, and that once the Arab armies had swept the Jews into the sea, the Palestinians can return to their homes. That was the conventional wisdom, and with a few minor exceptions on the margins, it was pretty much accepted by everybody, both in the world of scholarship as well as in the mainstream of political life. Come the late 1980s, some Israeli historians began looking into the documentary record because there were some recently opened archives in Israel. And they look at the record and they say, well, there's no evidence for this claim of Arab radio broadcasts. The main historian on the topic, familiar, I suspect, to some number of people in the room, is a fellow named Benny Morris, who's currently a professor at Ben-Gurion University. And Benny Morris, recently, the way he puts it, is he says there was, and now I'm quoting him, a partial ethnic cleansing in 1948. And in fact, you could say, I think, with a certain amount of accuracy, that now there's a broad consensus among historians that what happened in 1948 was an ethnic cleansing. The usual claims about Arab radio broadcasts have, in serious scholarship, have been completely discarded. The only question that now remains is a pretty narrow one. Some people say, Benny Morris being among them, that the Palestinians were ethnically cleansed not due to premeditation, not due to a intention, but rather in the course of wars, everybody knows refugees are generated, and these Palestinians were generated in the course of the war. So his famous formulation was, and is, that the Palestinian refugee question was born of war, not by design. And then there are other historians who, looking at the same information, say not true. The Palestinians were expelled with premeditation, that from early on the Zionist movement understood that the only way it can create a Jewish state in Palestine was by, they used a euphemism back then, was by transferring the Arabs out of Palestine. So as you can see, the range of debate is very narrow now. Pretty much everyone agrees it was an ethnic cleansing. The question is, how much was premeditated? And in fact, to give you an example of just how narrow the debate is, how uncontroversial the debate is, Israel's former foreign minister, the fellow who negotiated at Camp David with President Clinton, Prime Minister Barak, and Yasser Arafat, the foreign minister is a fellow named Shlomo Ben-Ami. And Shlomo Ben-Ami recently came out with a book entitled Scars of War, Wounds of Peace. He happens to be an intelligent fellow. He's a historian by training. His diplomat's hat is a second hat. And in the book he writes, first of all, he says it's true. This is the foreign minister speaking. The Palestinians were ethnically cleansed in 1948. There's no point in denying it anymore. And then he goes on to say, I have to say I was surprised. He goes on to say, I disagree with Benny Morris. I, the former foreign minister, I think it was premeditated. I think, to quote him, it was anchored in Zionist ideology. I think David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, I think he wanted it to happen, and he made sure it happened. And that, I think, is a quite vivid illustration that even Israel's ruling elite, former foreign minister, they now go along with, or he now goes along with, the most extreme interpretation of what Israel did in 1948. That's the historical record, or one illustration of the lack of controversy in the historical record. Let's now turn to the current scene, which mostly means the human rights record. And there I think it's even more astonishing the level of a consensus, the lack of controversy about what's happening. Let me briefly provide or sketch in the background. Israel-Palestine is among the most heavily monitored areas in the world by human rights organizations. There are the big organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, local human rights organizations like B'Tselem, Al-Haq, Physicians for Human Rights in Israel, Public Committee Against Torture in Israel, lots of organizations watching what's happening. That's number one. Number two, international law, when it comes to these issues like human rights, it's a relatively new branch of international law, which means there's a lot of gray areas about the application of the law, a lot of room, let me emphasize that, room for disagreement about the application of the law when it comes to concrete situations. Number three, a lot of human rights work is vulnerable to human fallibility, because a lot of human rights work consists of the following. There is a demonstration, for example, in the city of Hebron, and on the one side there is the Palestinians, on the other side is the Israeli army. And there's talk that there will be a demonstration and there may be clashes. So the human rights organizations send out their field observers to watch what's happening. And they go to the demonstration. In fact, a clash does ensue. And the human rights worker first turns to the Palestinian side, perhaps, and asks the questions. Did the Palestinians initiate the clash? And if they did they use stones or did they use live ammunition? And if they used live ammunition, were they on the periphery of the crowd or were they in the heart of the crowd? For human rights organizations and human rights law, those are all pertinent questions. And then they'll turn to the Israeli side. Did the Israeli soldiers initiate the clash? And if they did, were they in a life-threatening position? And if they were, did they fire warning shots? And if they did they aim at the legs? Did they aim at the torso? Did they aim at the head? Those are all also relevant questions in human rights law. So as you could see, most of you are, not most, but some of you are familiar with that famous Kurosawa film, Rashomon. How many people know Rashomon? Good. Oh, this is a smart crowd. Among college students, I wouldn't get that reaction. Unless there is a remake with Brad Pitt. And Jennifer Lopez, I know. The Rashomon is the famous Japanese film about several people who bear witness to the same event and have completely different memories about what happened, and it's supposed to demonstrate the fallibility of human memory and also the fallibility of human observation. Well, given all of these factors, so many different organizations, a human rights law with lots of gray areas, a lot of the human rights work susceptible to human fallibility and error, you would expect that there would be lots of differences and disagreements about what is the actual human rights record in the occupied territories. And I have to say, it did come as something of a surprise to me in the process of writing the last book, the Beyond Chutzpah book. I went through several thousand pages of human rights reports. They write a lot. Nobody reads them, but they write a lot. And I went through the thousands of pages of human rights reports, and I can say, without fear of contradiction, and I'm searching my soul now as I'm about to utter the words, I can say over thousands of pages of human rights reports for a 20-year period, roughly beginning 1988, for a 20-year period, I was only able to find one case of one demonstration on one afternoon in one city where two human rights organizations disagreed about what happened in one incident. That's it. There is no controversy whatever about what Israel's real human rights record is in the occupied territories. So let's just briefly look at that record in terms of current events. In January 2006, the Islamic movement came to power, was elected to power in the occupied territories, Hamas. And immediately as Hamas came to power, a very brutal economic boycott was imposed on Hamas and the Palestinians by the international community led by the United States, but certainly including the European Union. And one of the demands that was put on Hamas in order to get economic relations restored, one of the demands that was put in order to end the sanctions, Hamas had to renounce violence. And to my thinking, that's a perfectly, when I say violence, terrorism, the targeting of civilians for political ends, the standard definition of terrorism. And to my thinking, that's a perfectly legitimate demand to put on any movement or any group that the terrorism, the targeting of civilians is illegal under international law. That's pretty uncontroversial. It's the basic principle of international law, what's called the principle of distinction, to distinguish between civilians and combatants. So to impose that demand on Hamas was perfectly legitimate, in my view. The problem is, as everybody in this room knows, that a moral principle is a moral principle only if it's applied across the board. If you apply it to everyone, it's a moral principle. If you apply it to only one side, it's called a hypocritical principle. Well, what does the record show? The record here is pretty straightforward. Since the beginning of the Second Intifada, which is to say September 28, 2000 till today, there have been approximately 4,000 Palestinians killed, approximately 1,000 Israelis killed. On both sides, the ratio of civilians to combatants killed is approximately 2/3, 1/2 to 2/3. On both sides, about 2/3, 1/2 to 2/3 have been civilians. So on that basic principle of distinction between combatants and civilians, Israel's record is 4 times as bad as the record of the Palestinians, and in particular the record of Hamas. Well, some of you will say that's not really entirely accurate, what I'm saying, because there's a difference between targeting civilians, which is what Hamas is accused of doing, and Israel, which doesn't purposely kill civilians, rather Israel's civilians' deaths as a result of Israeli firing are what's called collateral damage. It's unintentional. But what does the record actually show? Well, the human rights reports have written extensively on the casualties, the deaths in the occupied territories. And they repeatedly report that Israel uses excessive, indiscriminate fire, and on many occasions it deliberately targets civilians. In addition, the human rights organizations make the point, which is valid under international law, that if you kill people indiscriminately, there's no difference between killing them indiscriminately and intentionally killing them. The point is fairly obvious on a moment's reflection. If Hamas were, as it has, blows up a civilian bus in Tel Aviv, and then when they're asked, why did you do that? They said, well, we didn't really intend to kill the passengers. We wanted to just wreck the bus. Well, people would laugh. That's obviously a transparently absurd defense. But if Israel does, as it has, drops a 1-ton bomb in a densely populated neighborhood of Gaza, and it kills 14 people, 9 of them babies, and then they're asked, why did you do that? They said, but we didn't intend to kill those people. We just wanted to kill a terrorist. The explanation is as transparently absurd as if Hamas said, we only wanted to destroy the bus. And that's why the human rights organizations, and now I'm quoting the leading Israeli human rights organization in the occupied territories, a very excellent organization, B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories. It says that when so many civilians have been killed and wounded, the lack of intent makes no difference. Israel remains responsible. That means, as a bottom line, that the only difference between Israeli and Hamas terrorism is that Israeli terrorism is about 4 times as lethal, and no demand is being put on Israel to renounce terrorism as a condition for international acceptance. The only demand is being put on Hamas. Let me turn to that third dimension of the conflict, namely how to resolve the conflict. Now, everybody in this room knows that's, we're told, is the eternal conundrum, how to resolve the Israel-Palestine conflict. In fact, there's few, probably no conflicts in the world today where there has been such a consensus, such a broad consensus over so long a period on how to resolve the conflict. For the past 30 years, the international community has agreed on how to resolve the conflict. I suspect nearly everybody in the room is familiar with it. It's called the two-state settlement. And basically the two-state settlement means Israel has to fully withdraw from the territories it occupied in the June 67 war. That means the West Bank, including Jerusalem and Gaza, because that's international law. It's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. That's what the World Court said. Israel has to fully withdraw, and a newly formed Palestinian state, as well as neighboring Arab states, has to recognize Israel's right to live in peace and security with its neighbors. That's it. Not very complicated. Well, then what's the problem? The problem is easily understood when you just look at the annual UN votes. Because every year, the United Nations General Assembly votes on that two-state settlement. And what does the vote look like? Let's take 2 examples. 1989, the United Nations General Assembly votes on the two-state settlement. The vote is 151 to 3. 1 abstention. The whole world on one side, 3 on the other. 151 countries for the two-state settlement, 3 against. The United States, Israel, and the island state of Dominica. That's it. People often used to ask me why Dominica, and I used to say that was all that the dollar could buy back then. Now, between 1989 and today, 15 years have elapsed, but as it happens in terms of history, those were 15 significant years. An entire social system, the Soviet-type system, disappeared, and in its wake, many new states were created. You'll be surprised, I suspect, to learn that in 1989, there were 155 states in the world system. Now the United Nations currently has 191 members. Nearly 40 new states were created in the last 15 years. So you could say there have been world historic changes in the map and the political map and the geographic map of the world. What's quite striking, however, is notwithstanding all the changes in the map of the world, the consensus on how to end the conflict remains very firm, very constant. So if you look at the votes for 2000, 2001, 2, 3, 4 in the United Nations General Assembly, the vote is always the same. The whole world on one side, and on the other side, it's always the same 7 countries. The United States, Israel, Palau, P-A-L-A-U, Nauru, N-A-U-R-U, Tuvalu, T-U-V-A-L-U, Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands. That's it. That's it. The whole world on one side, the United States, Israel, Palau, Nauru, Tuvalu, Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands. Now I see there are some embarrassed looks on this. Some people are looking very stern. They don't want to reveal that they don't know what Nauru, Palau, and Tuvalu are. Others are more frank. You can judge from their looks that they don't know. I'll be honest, I teach the topic. I didn't know what they were. Now I've since come to know because people email me all the time about Nauru, Palau, and Tuvalu. Not that I don't have enough emails as it is, but for those of you who are interested, Nauru's main export, it's a South Sea atoll, tiny little island. Its main export is guano, which is what? Bird droppings, yes, guano. Tuvalu, no offense intended, but it seems like it's rapidly disappearing, so we don't have to think too hard about it. It's disappearing due to global warming, which is an interesting story because, as most of you know, the main reason for global warming at this point is because the United States refuses to sign the Kyoto Protocol. So because the U.S. refuses to sign the Kyoto Protocol, the tide is rising, and as the tide is rising, Tuvalu is disappearing. And as Tuvalu is disappearing, Israel is losing one of its main allies in the United Nations. So it's only a matter of time before they accuse the United States of anti-Semitism, which brings us back to tonight's topic. Well, let's now try to relate that finding to the current events again. As you no doubt know, there were 2 conditions that were put on the Palestinians in order to get those sanctions lifted from the international community. One was to end the violence, the terrorism, and the second one was that they had to recognize the state of Israel. And as I said in the first issue, I think that's pretty uncontroversial. Israel is a member state of the United Nations, and it has the same right as any member state to live in peace and security with its neighbors. Pretty straightforward. The problem, again, is the application of that principle across the board. On the Hamas side, the record is, I think we can say with a certain amount of honesty, the record is an ambiguous one or an ambivalent one, whichever word you prefer. Hamas has sent signals that it's willing to negotiate on the June 67 borders. It's not said it will recognize Israel. It's willing to have what it calls, the Arabic term is a hudna, which basically means, for our purposes, a long-term armistice, which under international law is actually one way to resolve the problem. That's Hamas's record. We'll say for argument's sake, we'll say it's an ambiguous record, it's an ambivalent one. But what's the Israeli record? The Israeli record is not controversial at all. No Israeli government, no Israeli political party, no Israeli official has ever recognized the right of the Palestinians to a state within the whole of the occupied territories. That's not controversial at all. The the Israeli position up until 1997, the Labor Party never recognized the right of the Palestinians to a state. Then they did, but to a very limited state. In fact, you could say it's not really a state. The position of the Likud, the current ruling party, well, it's not the current any longer, the other main political faction in Israel, has been equally minimalist. The position they're offering now to the Palestinians is basically, to quote The Economist, they're offering the Palestinians a Swiss cheese state, namely these tiny islets of Palestinian sovereignty surrounded by Israeli settlers. What does the picture look like? Well, number one, as I said, at the level of verbal pronouncements, the Hamas position has been ambivalent, ambiguous. On the Israeli side, no Israeli government has ever recognized the right of the Palestinians to a state in accordance with the international consensus. That's at the level of words. But as we all know, actions count for a lot more than words. What are the actions? Well, as we speak, Israel is building a wall in the occupied territories which will absorb approximately 10% of the land and crucial water resources in the occupied territories. That's on one side. On the other side, Israel has de facto annexed the Jordan Valley, which is another 25% of the West Bank. In addition, the settlements in the north, there's a settlement called Ariel, cuts deeply enough into the West Bank that the northern sector is cut in half. And then in the middle, there's a big settlement called Ma'ale Adunim, which effectively cuts the West Bank in half again. And so basically what Israel is offering the Palestinians, and I'll return to that in a moment, not in words, but in actions, right as we speak, is a Bantustan in the style of what the South African government offered the indigenous population during the apartheid era. I'll return to that in a moment, and it's an interesting issue to look at, especially in terms of the question of anti-Semitism. I would just want to emphasize, if I use language like apartheid, Bantustans, anywhere else except here, I don't mean this church, I mean in our country, it's simply not controversial. And it will become even uncontroversial here, I think, pretty soon, because as I think many of you know, some of you know, in a couple of weeks, November 14th, a week from now, former President Jimmy Carter is coming out with a book entitled Peace, Not Apartheid, referring to the occupied territories. Because that's the reality. That's the reality, as any sane person looking at the actual map, looking at the Israeli proposals, that's the reality that's being rapidly created in the occupied territories. Okay, that's the first half of my remarks. The record, which I claim is not controversial. In fact, I think it's quite simple and straightforward. Now the second half. If what I'm saying is true, then I have a very tall order now. I have to try to account for all of that controversy. And where does it come from? And the argument I'm going to make, as I suggested earlier, is that most of that controversy is simply fabricated. It's concocted. There are elements of it which, in my opinion, are legitimate. And let me look at those quickly first. The legitimate differences on the Israel-Palestine conflict. So let me try to illustrate and give an example of what I think is a legitimate difference, a legitimate controversy. Let's take the question of those Palestinian refugees who we spoke about earlier this evening. You can agree on facts, but render a different moral judgment on those facts. It's not true that moral judgments spring from facts. That's not accurate. So let's look at those refugees. Let's take that fellow I mentioned earlier on, Benny Morris. As I said, he's Israel's leading authority on the origins of the Palestinian refugee question. And Morris acknowledges what happened in 1948 was an ethnic cleansing. Factually, he has no problem with that. But morally, he says, I don't think it was a bad thing. I think sometimes ethnic cleansings are good things. They're not always bad things. And he cites as his prime example the United States. He says the United States could not have become that great republic had it not ethnically cleansed the indigenous population. And he says in the same way, in my opinion, the goal of a Jewish state was so desirable that if it required the ethnic cleansing of the indigenous population, I think it was a price worth paying. So morally, he thinks the ethnic cleansing was okay. Or you can take the example of Professor Dershowitz of Harvard. He says that ethnic cleansings are, in his words, fifth-rate human rights issues analogous to massive urban renewal. Well, those are moral judgments. And you cannot say moral judgments are wrong in the same way as you can say facts are wrong. You can disagree with the moral judgment. You could say it's a Nazi moral judgment, but you can't say it's a wrong moral judgment. There are a separate category of thought, so to speak, from establishing the factual record. Now, if we leave Mr. Morris and Mr. Dershowitz aside, and we return to the moral universe of normal human beings, we still have complications. It's still not simple. Here's a little trickier one. You can agree on the facts, you can agree in your moral judgments, you can agree in your legal judgments, but still disagree in your political judgments. Now, that one comes as, I think, a bit of more of a surprise, because most people assume their political judgments spring from their moral judgments. But it's not really so. Let's take another person, not Mr. Morris, but someone who's more familiar to you and who you all love and ought to, I think, Professor Chomsky. Professor Chomsky says, well, of course, the Palestinians were ethnically cleansed in 1948. No real dispute among historians about that. Morally, of course, it was an abomination. No real dispute about that among sane people. Legally, it's not controversial. Palestinians have a right to return. But he says, politically, I just don't think it's going to happen. I don't think it's realistic. And he says, in fact, if you hold out the hope to people in refugee camps that they're going to return, when in fact they're not, that's immoral. So, judgments are just that. They're judgments. You weigh many factors and you can come to different conclusions. I don't think there's a right or wrong here. I think that different people weighing the different factors can come to different conclusions. Some may say, weighing all the factors, no. I think it's a realistic possibility the Palestinians will be able to return. In that case, they have a legitimate case to keep struggling for it. And others weighing the factors say, no, I don't think it's possible. In which case, Professor Chomsky, I think, is right. It's immoral to hold out hopes for people when those hopes are unrealistic. That, to me, is a legitimate difference, and one which honest people have to agree to disagree on. Having said that, I have to enter two qualifications. Number one, there is no disagreement whatsoever on the broad parameters for resolving the conflict, the two-state settlement, and there is no disagreement among rational people about who's blocking that settlement. It's the United States and Israel. Number two, you can disagree on the practicality, the political dimension of the refugee question. But what you cannot disagree on is the moral and legal dimension. I was myself quite surprised to learn when I was going through the record of the human rights organizations, all the major human rights organizations, and I think it'll come as a surprise to you, they have all come out in favor of the Palestinian right of return. Not because they are flag-waving Palestinian nationalists or Palestinophiles. No, that's not the reason. The reason is very different. It's because they went through the law, they looked at comparable situations elsewhere in the world, and it was impossible not to support the Palestinian right of return under international law, because it's supported everywhere else, and the law is pretty clear on it. I can tell you that in Human Rights Watch, an organization which many of you are familiar with, Human Rights Watch gets a lot of its money from liberal Jews and liberal Jewish organizations. And they did not want to conclude that the Palestinians have a right of return because they were afraid the plugs were going to be pulled on them. And it was a very heated dispute inside the organization. And I've had a chance to look at the internal documents and the internal debate, and I was quite surprised. You look through the debate, the documents and everything. I should add that for the first time in Human Rights Watch's history, members of the board of directors hired outside lawyers in order to prove there was no right of return. But they couldn't. The law is pretty tough. You know, if you have honest people using the law, it's pretty rigid. It's when you have shysters and crooks that the law gets tied up into a pretzel. But among honest people, it's pretty rigid. And it was rigid enough that that Palestinian right of return was upheld. So on the moral and legal issues, I don't think there is a controversy. There is a legitimate controversy, I think, on the political question, whether it's a realistic demand. Okay, that's for the legitimate differences. Now, let me turn to those illegitimate differences, the fabricated differences, fabricated controversy, which is designed to sow discord and deflect attention from that documentary record, a thin layer of which I just reviewed for you. The first kind of fabricated controversy is this kind of mystification of the conflict, the claim that it's so profound, so complicated, that you have to have a knowledge the equivalent of rocket science in order to penetrate its mysteries. So we're told it's about ancient enmities. We're told it's about a cosmic clash of religions, a cosmic clash of civilizations. And we're told that it's, the fancy Latin word is, or expression, it's sui generis. It can't be compared to any other conflict. And the reason we're told that, it basically serves two purposes. Number one, we're told it's so complicated because it's designed to get everybody to question their normal moral intuitions. So you're told, looking at the human rights record, Israel was the only country in the world that legalized torture. Israel was the only country in the world which legalized hostage-taking. Israel was the only country in the world which legalized house demolitions as a legal form of punishment, except for a short period under the regime of Saddam Hussein. Well, the normal moral intuition is to find that pretty appalling. But then you're told, you don't understand. The conflict is much more complicated. And if you understood how complicated it was, you'd realize that what at first glance seems appalling actually isn't. And so this claim of the complicatedness of the conflict is used in order to stifle your ordinary moral intuitions, which tell you something pretty appalling is happening. The second purpose is you're told it's so complicated, it's unique, it's sui generis, if you hang out with that crowd. It's sui generis, you can't compare. And the reason you're told not to compare is because if you make the most obvious comparisons, Israel comes out on the wrong side. So if you look at the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict, the indigenous population, the settlers coming from Europe, claiming religious persecution, expelling and exterminating the indigenous population, well, it sounds and looks awfully lot like what happened in North America. But when you make that comparison, Israel comes out on the wrong side. So do not compare. Or if you look at the current scene, Israel looks like Israel and the occupied territories. It looks an awful lot like South Africa during the apartheid regime. So you're told, do not compare.